University, and he's given us some information in reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the assassination of African American leaders during the 1960s. And Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can pick up from where you left off, dealing with the evolution of civil rights in the United States, and the most important one, while we celebrate the 50th anniversary of that act this year. Let's talk about it from the perspective of the impact that it had upon the violence that came as a result of it and the death of these African American leaders.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I had talked earlier about how this Civil Rights Act of 1964 was part of a whole history of civil rights acts. But I think you were right in saying that it also has to be understood in terms of the violence that was going on in what scholars call the bloody 1960s, because we had a lot of assassinations in the 1960s. The assassination of Medgar Evers in June 1963. And that contributed, I think, to the climate that led to the civil rights movement. Not only the assassination of Medgar Evers, but also the Birmingham Crusade in Birmingham with Fred Shuttleworth and Martin Luther King Jr., the March on Washington in August 1963. We know that all of these events impacted developments which led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, created the climate for that particular piece of legislation. Because at that time, and I should say also that the Civil Rights Act, I think, was the culmination of a series of events that began with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56. Because if you look at the bus boycott, you'll note that it was about access to public accommodations. The right to ride the city buses without what? Without being Jim Crowed, abused, physically attacked. So I like to think of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as the culmination of almost a decade of struggle. And not only that, as you said, the assassination of figures like Medgar Evers in 1963 sort of helped create the climate for the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which interestingly enough was the most comprehensive, as I said, of the civil rights bills going back to the late 19th century, because this bill, of course, dealt with job discrimination, it dealt with education, it dealt with voting, it dealt with not only public accommodations, but also public facilities, arguing that there should be no discrimination at all of these levels.
Very good, and so the assassination of Medgar Evers, why don't you give us some information in reference to what happened in reference to Medgar Evers and perhaps Malcolm as well as Dr. Martin Luther King, and then to see if we can bring that all together in reference to the
We know that Medgar Evers was assassinated in June '63 by Baldwin de Beckwith. And of course, I think that assassination was very important because Medgar Evers was involved with the NAACP in Mississippi and had been working for years to get people in Mississippi the right to vote and to strike down the barriers that had been created by Jim Crow. So his assassination, I think, was particularly important in terms of creating the climate for the Civil Rights Act. Now, if we look at the assassination of Malcolm X, it occurs in February 1965. So that's after the Civil Rights Act. But it did help create a kind of climate that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And of course, we know that King was assassinated in 1968. And he was assassinated because he was trying to get the federal government, in part, to implement the provisions of these different pieces of legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, very little was done by presidents, by Senate, by the House of Representatives to really implement the provisions of these pieces of legislation. And Dr. King, I think, was assassinated because this is what he was about, trying to make sure that the provisions of both the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would be implemented in an effort to really bring about what he called the realization of the American dream.
And so in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin, when you look back over this particular period, and you see all of the hardship that was suffered by the African community.
That's right.
In reference to the assassination of these individuals, then I think that we might be able to say that they literally gave their lives in a real sense for the civil rights of Africans, well, for the civil rights.
Exactly.
Because the act did not say for Africans only. It was the Civil Rights Act, and it included many other groups that might fall within the range of that. But nevertheless, this was all of this violence that was associated with it. Now, what about the death of those youth in Mississippi at this time?
Yes, you talk about Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. 3 young men, 2 Jewish young men, 1 black young man, who were in Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi, to educate black people, to put in place a strategy for registering them to vote and that kind of thing. They were killed.